Every night the woods echo with a scream. Dare to discover why? Chapter 1. The fading sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and pink as Brad and Amy's camper van bumped along the deeply rutted dirt road. The dense forest pressed in on both sides, shrouding the path ahead in growing darkness. They were miles from civilization, having turned off the highway in search of an isolated place to camp for the night. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Amy asked, peering out the window at the endless rows of trees passing by. "We're in the middle of nowhere." "That's exactly why I picked this spot," Brad said, downshifting as the road inclined steeply. "We'll have the woods all to ourselves tonight. Just wait until you see how clear the stars are without any city lights polluting the sky." Amy smiled, always impressed by Brad's sense of adventure. He was constantly dragging her out of her comfort zone, but she loved him for it. She leaned back in her seat, taking in a deep breath of pine-scented air, wafting through the open windows as the dense forest enveloped them. By the time Brad spied a clearing just off the road wide enough to park their van, dusk had faded to night. A blanket of stars glittered overhead as Brad built a crackling campfire, the flickering light pushing back the inky darkness of the woods. He wrapped a blanket around Amy's shoulders as they roasted hot dogs and sipped steaming mugs of coffee. Later, they lay curled up together under piles of blankets in the cozy rear bed of their van, legs intertwined. The gentle sounds of crickets and the soft popping of the dying fire soon lulled them to sleep. All was peaceful. A blood-curdling scream pierced the quiet night, jolting Brad and Amy instantly awake. Amy clutched Brad's arm, eyes wide with alarm. The chilling scream lasted no more than 30 seconds before abruptly stopping, leaving only deafening silence again. "What the hell was that?" Brad whispered. "It sounded human," Amy replied, voice quaking. They leapt up, Brad grabbing his flashlight. He swept the beam around outside, illuminating only silent trees. The clearing was empty, undisturbed. Brad hurried farther from the van, searching for any sign of the source of the screams. But he found nothing amiss in the inky woods. The narrow beam of his flashlight cut through the blackness between the trees, revealing no clues. Uneasy, they retreated back to the van, securing the doors. Neither could shake the chilling memory of those anguished screams. Sleep eluded them for the rest of the night as they huddled together, straining their ears for any further sounds. But nothing stirred in the darkness beyond. Chapter 2. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows across the van's interior. Amy woke feeling groggy after the mostly sleepless night. The terrifying screams still echoed in her mind. Brad was already up, brewing coffee over the campfire. "Sleep okay?" he asked. "Not really," Amy admitted. She recounted the chilling screams from the darkness, making Brad shiver despite the warm fire. After breakfast, they drove back to the main road, finding a local diner. The waitress topped off their coffees as they told her about the strange incident from the night before. "You heard the screams too?" the waitress whispered, eyes widening. She leaned in, speaking in hushed tones about the legend of the Forrester family who had been brutally murdered in those very woods years before. Some claimed their anguished ghosts still haunted the area after dark. Amy felt a chill run down her spine despite the warm diner. Brad rubbed her shoulders reassuringly, but his face looked troubled. After eating, they decided to drive to the nearest ranger station and report the screams. The ranger's face paled as they recounted the chilling cries piercing the night. "I must insist you avoid camping anywhere near those woods after nightfall," he said gravely. He shared documented accounts from other campers who had fled the area in terror after hearing the haunting screams emerge from the forest at midnight. Leaving the ranger station, Brad and Amy debated whether to continue their camping trip or just head home. The frightening tales weighed on them, but they ultimately decided to return to their campsite for one more night before leaving the ominous forest behind for good. Back at the campsite, Brad busied himself gathering extra firewood while Amy organized supplies in the van. The woods took on an eerie feel in the waning afternoon light. As sunset neared, Brad started a large bonfire, hoping to keep the darkness at bay. Neither felt much like eating as midnight crept closer. They stared wordlessly into the flickering firelight, both longing for sunrise when they could escape the terror that might emerge from the forest again that night. Chapter 3. The crackling fire did little to ease Brad and Amy's nerves as midnight approached. They sat huddled together on a log, peering out into the dense woods surrounding them. The memories of last night's blood-curdling screams lingered like a dark cloud over the campsite. Brad kept the fire stoked, the dancing flames providing a small circle of light and warmth to ward off the pressing darkness. But neither could ignore the unease creeping up their spines as the night wore on. Amy clung tightly to Brad's arm as the hour approached. The fire snapped and glowed, but beyond its reach the forest was a vast, lightless void. Anything could be lurking just out of sight among the trees. At 5 minutes to midnight, Brad added a thick log to the flames. "It's going to be fine," he said, in a voice tinged with doubt. Amy tried to believe him, but found herself holding her breath as midnight arrived. Right on cue, a distant scream echoed from the woods, so chilling every hair on Amy's body stood on end. She buried her face against Brad's chest as more screams arose, wavering and terrible, full of anguish. This lasted longer than the night before, at least a full minute of haunting cries. When silence returned, Brad realized Amy was crying softly into his shirt. He wrapped his arms around her, feeling her whole body trembling. Neither could comprehend the suffering conveyed in those screams, but they pierced right to the bone. As the fire died down, Brad knew they couldn't stay here another night. Amy readily agreed when he suggested leaving first thing in the morning. Neither slept, keeping anxious vigil until faint light crept back into the sky. Only then did they finally pack up camp to escape the woods and its ghostly horrors. Chapter 4. Brad awoke to Amy shaking his shoulder, morning sunlight streaming into the van. After the harrowing night filled with those chilling screams, exhaustion had finally won out just before dawn. "Brad, get up. I think you need to see this." Amy's voice sounded tense. Brad groggily followed her gaze out the van's back windows. His eyes widened as he spotted what had caught her attention. Just visible off the dirt road through the trees was a small, decrepit wooden shack. It seemed to be hidden back away from the road intentionally. "Was that there before?" Brad asked, skin prickling. "I don't know, but I don't like it. This whole area gives me the creeps now," Amy replied with a shiver. After a quick, quiet breakfast, Brad cautiously made his way toward the shack while Amy reluctantly followed behind. A rickety porch creaked under their steps as they peered inside the dirty window. It was too dark to make much out. Taking a deep breath, Brad pushed open the stuck wooden door. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light piercing the gloom within. The one-room interior was dim and nondescript, except for the far wall. Crude letters had been scrawled there in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. Amy gasped as she made out words like murder and revenge next to incomprehensible scribblings. Brad's stomach turned as he noticed a collection of worn toys piled in one corner. The phrase "no more screams" was smeared above them. "We need to get the hell out of here," Brad said, pulling Amy back towards the van, eager to escape this unsettling place. As the tires spun on the dirt road away from that scene, Brad couldn't help but feel they were being watched from the shadows of the woods. The further they got from the abandoned shack, the more a sense of relief washed over them. But it was short-lived. Only a few miles down the winding dirt road, the van sputtered and backfired. Black smoke poured from the engine as Brad guided it to the shoulder. Despite Brad's efforts to restart it, the engine was dead. With sunset only a couple hours away, dread crept back in. Without cell service this far out, they were stranded for the night. As darkness fell, Brad got a fire going while Amy sat nervously in the van. She knew the screams would come again at midnight, and they were trapped with nowhere to escape to this time. All they could do was huddle together and pray for sunrise. Chapter 5. Night descended rapidly, the shadows around the stranded van deepening. Brad kept the fire stoked and burning brightly, gathering as much wood as he could find to last until morning. Amy stayed close to the flames, dreading the arrival of midnight and the terror it would bring. "We're going to be okay," Brad said, though worry crept into his voice. He could tell Amy was shaken to the core being stuck out here again with those screams surely on their way. He wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and pulled her close. As the fire began dying down, faint echoes drifted through the trees, the first of the night's screams rising in the distance. Amy's eyes went wide. "They're starting already," she whispered. "What are we going to do?" "Just stay by the fire," Brad said, though he knew the flames provided little comfort. As midnight neared, the screams intensified, no longer distant, but surrounding them on all sides. The couple huddled together, illuminated in the firelight as the screams went on and on, reverberating through the woods. When the last echoes faded, Amy was softly crying into Brad's shirt. He smoothed her hair, at a loss for how to help. As she wiped her eyes, Amy noticed a faint glow through the trees behind Brad. "What is that?" she asked nervously. Brad turned to see distant flickering lights filtering through the dense forest. They almost appeared to float in the darkness. Gripping Amy's hand, he said, "Stay here. I'm going to go look." Brad crept toward the odd lights, Amy anxiously waiting by the dying fire. The lights led him to a decrepit cabin nestled between the trees. Ghostly candles flickered in the windows. Brad hesitated, then pulled open the creaking door to reveal the nightmarish secrets within. Chapter 6. Brad crept toward the eerie glowing cabin, heart pounding. Inside, candles cast dancing shadows across the dim interior. Strange symbols and arcane objects covered every surface. Brad froze as his eyes adjusted to the gloom. "Get out of here," a raspy voice suddenly growled from the shadows, making Brad jump. An unkempt man emerged holding a large knife poised to strike. Brad reacted on instinct, kicking the blade from his hand before rushing back outside. "We need to go now," Brad urged, grabbing a startled Amy's hand as he sprinted past the confused man. They crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping their skin as they ran from the cabin's unknown horrors. Finally winded, they collapsed beside a gurgling creek. Brad explained the creepy candles and violent stranger, making Amy shake her head in disbelief. "This place just keeps getting more terrifying. What are we going to do?" she lamented. Brad tried to think. With no van and miles from help, they had no choice but to keep moving on foot and hope to find a road or ranger station. But midnight was fast approaching again, and soon those haunting screams would return. Staying near the creek for water, they continued their desperate trek deeper into the watchful woods. The canopy grew dense overhead, blocking out any light or hope. Exhausted, they stopped again, only to hear the distant screams rising once more as darkness fell. "Run," Brad yelled, pulling a petrified Amy along as the screams amplified behind them. They crashed blindly through the undergrowth, the midnight cries seeming to follow their trail. Just as they were ready to collapse, they stumbled upon an overgrown dirt access road and a miraculous parked truck. Salvation at last. Chapter 7. Brad shone his flashlight beam through the truck's dusty windows. It appeared empty. Trying the driver's side door, it opened with a creak. "Think this thing will run?" Amy asked desperately, glancing around at the pitch-dark forest surrounding them. The distant screams were increasing steadily as midnight approached. Only one way to find out. Brad ripped away the plastic under the steering column to expose the wires. It took a few tries before the engine sputtered to life. "Oh, thank God," Amy sighed, jumping into the passenger seat. Brad sent up a prayer of thanks as he pulled onto the narrow dirt road. As they bumped along, the screams intensified until they seemed to echo all around the moving truck. Amy clamped her hands over her ears, clenching her eyes shut and willing it all to go away. Suddenly, a dark figure darted into the road ahead. Brad slammed the brakes, making the truck fish-tail dangerously. The shadowy apparition stood motionless as they passed right through it, making Amy scream. "What is happening?" she cried. Brad just shook his head, resolutely staring at the road ahead. More shadowy shapes emerged from the woods, converging on the road behind them. The truck's tank soon ran dry. forcing them to abandon it and flee on foot again into the screams rising from the forest. They clung to each other, lost in a nightmare, praying the sun would rise before whatever evil inhabited these woods could find them. Just when all hope seemed lost, the tree line opened up ahead. They stumbled onto an empty ranger station parking lot with the headlights of a truck approaching. Never had they felt so relieved to see another human being. Chapter 8. Brad and Amy waved frantically as the truck pulled into the ranger station lot. The grizzled driver stepped out, eyeing them warily. "Please, you have to help us," Amy cried. "There's something horrible in the woods, these screams." The ranger held up a hand. "You two look like you've been to hell and back. Get in, and we'll talk." Inside the small station, huddled around a space heater, Brad and Amy recounted their terrifying ordeal. The ranger listened grimly, nodding as if he'd heard it all before. "Those woods have been plagued for decades," he finally said. "Some evil took root out there long ago and has never let go." He sighed heavily. "I've tried to warn people away, but every year a few poor souls still wander in unprepared." Amy shivered, thinking they had almost joined the growing list of lost camping souls. She gripped Brad's hand tightly, beyond grateful he had got them out alive. As dawn light peeked through the windows, the ranger agreed to give them a ride back to their van. "Stick to the main roads from now on," he advised as they parted ways. Brad started the repaired engine with relief. Heading home, Amy knew she would never shake the bone-chilling memory of those nights in the forest. The screams still echoed in her mind. She glanced back at the receding tree line uneasily. "Do you think anyone will ever figure out what's going on back there?" she asked Brad. "I hope so," he replied grimly. "But whatever is haunting those woods, it's real, and it's deadly." With that chilling thought, they drove on in silence, wanting only to leave the living nightmare far behind. But deep down, they both feared the darkness would never fully release its grip on them. Chapter 9. In the days after their harrowing ordeal, Brad noticed Amy growing increasingly withdrawn. She barely slept, often waking from nightmares where those wretched screams still pursued her. Dark circles formed under eyes that held a new wariness. "I can't stop thinking about those poor souls we heard in the woods," she told Brad one evening, voice quivering. "We escaped, but what about all those who didn't? The families who never knew what happened to their loved ones." Brad hugged her, wishing he could erase the trauma, but knowing it was futile. Whatever malevolent force dwelled in that forest had scarred them both. Amy became obsessed with researching the area's sinister history, seeking any clue to the source of the screams. She learned that locals avoided the woods even in daylight, warning outsiders to do the same. But she needed to know more. One morning, Brad found an open web browser on Amy's laptop, an article about a psychic medium coming to a nearby town. "You're not actually considering this?" Brad asked warily. "She might be able to contact them, help those spirits move on," Amy insisted. Despite Brad's misgivings, 2 days later they sat in the hushed back room of a New Age shop. The purported psychic, draped in wispy scarves, closed her eyes and spread her palms on the table between them. The woman's face contorted, voice growing raspy. "So much pain," she moaned. "An ancient evil, never-ending, must warn others away." Amy looked satisfied, but Brad remained skeptical. As they left, he said gently, "I'm not sure she told us anything we didn't already know." Amy sighed. "I had to try something," she said softly. Brad nodded, knowing the cold truth. Sometimes the dead kept their secrets, and the darkness could never be fully banished. Chapter 10. A year had passed since that fateful camping trip, but Amy still felt haunted. She knew Brad was worried about her relentless fixation on those screams in the night. She didn't blame him. She could feel herself unraveling. She began taking long, solitary drives, inevitably drawn back to the rural roads skirting the cursed forest. She would sit parked on the side of the road, gazing into the shadowy trees, mesmerized by a darkness that now lived inside her. Late one afternoon, before she even realized where she was headed, Amy found herself stalling outside the entrance to that ill-omened dirt road. The sun was rapidly sinking towards the tree line. Some voice compelled her to walk forward into the forest as if in a trance. By the time she blinked back to awareness, she was alone in the enveloping woods as dusk faded to night. The familiar panic rose in her chest. Then, in the distance, she heard the first of the screams begin to stir. Amy fled through the trees, skin prickling at the memory of untold horrors. But she knew it was hopeless. As midnight struck, the forest came alive with a cacophony of screams surrounding her. She collapsed to the ground, sobbing and begging for the torment to end. As the ghastly cries rose to a fever pitch, she cried out, "I'm sorry. I couldn't save you." Then, silence. The screams ceased abruptly. Amy froze as a young woman emerged from the trees in a tattered dress, eyes full of sadness. "We are beyond saving," she said softly. "But you still have a chance. Go and warn others." As Amy watched in awe, the girl turned and faded back into the shadows between the trees, followed by the souls of all those lost. Chapter 11. Amy didn't remember stumbling from the forest or finding her car along the deserted road. But morning light was peeking over the horizon as she sped away, hands shaking on the steering wheel. Had it been another vivid nightmare? Or a ghostly visitation? Amy didn't know what to believe, but she knew she couldn't pretend everything was normal any longer. When she arrived home, Brad took one look at her distraught face and drew her into his arms. "Tell me what happened," he implored, fear lacing his voice. Haltingly, Amy described her irresistible urge to return to the woods and the terrifying hours that followed. "I saw her, Brad. The girl who told me to warn others," Amy insisted, tears filling her eyes. She was real. Brad gazed at her, clearly struggling whether to trust his own skepticism or Amy's profound belief. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Then that's what we need to do," he said. Over the following weeks, Amy poured all her restless energy into spreading awareness about the dangers lurking within the remote forest. She left comments on local message boards, called into radio shows, wrote letters to park authorities, desperate to prevent more loss of life. Brad tracked down the families of those who had gone missing in the woods over the years, connecting them with Amy. She shared her story and belief that their loved ones were finally at peace. It seemed to offer these grieving relatives some small comfort. As time passed, Amy found the darkness that had clung to her spirit since that night finally begin to recede. She breathed deeply again without the screams echoing in her head. Her nightmares faded away. By warning others, she had reclaimed herself. Chapter 12. Over the next year, Brad watched with relief as the light slowly returned to Amy's eyes. She no longer seemed haunted by the events in the forest. She had found purpose in her mission to prevent others from meeting the same grim fate. Brad supported her efforts, but still felt perplexed by the supernatural encounter Amy described that night. She returned to the woods alone. He struggled to make sense of it all, wavering between belief and skepticism. His curiosity eventually got the better of him. One weekend, while Amy was out of town, Brad made the fateful decision to return to those woods himself. He had to know if what Amy saw was real. As dusk fell, Brad pulled his truck down the winding dirt road with a growing sense of apprehension. Parking near their original campsite, he headed into the woods on foot. The trees soon closed in around him, bringing an overwhelming rush of dread. Brad pushed on through his instinct scream to turn back. He had to find answers. Lost in the thick woods, he realized night had fallen. Then he heard it, the distant first screams rising. Chilled to the bone, Brad ran, but he knew escape was impossible. At the stroke of midnight, the agonized screams swelled, assaulting him from all sides. Brad cried out into the darkness, "Please, just tell me what happened to you." At once, the screams ceased. In the silence, a sad voice whispered, "Some questions are not meant for the living." Shadows stirred between the trees and then vanished. Shaken, Brad fled the forest, Amy's story at last sinking in. Returning home, he pulled her into his arms, knowing he would never doubt her again. There were evils in this world beyond comprehension. Chapter 13. In the following months, Brad found himself growing more protective of Amy. Her drive to warn others about the dangers lurking within those ominous woods had brought her peace of mind. But seeing her passion reignited also worried Brad. Though she insisted she had made her peace with the past, he still caught Amy gazing off distantly at times, her expression inscrutable. It was as if some darkness yet clung to her spirit, threatening to pull her back into the abyss. Brad thought again of that night he had returned to the forest alone, seeking answers. Even his brief encounter with the unrestful dead had shaken him to the core. He could only imagine the scars Amy carried from her longer ordeal. His worst fears were realized when he awoke one night to find Amy gone. Panic rising, Brad rushed to the garage only to see her car was missing too. There was only one place she could have gone. Speeding down the rural highway, Brad's mind raced, imagining what horrors Amy might be facing alone in those woods again. He should have known the evil lurking there would never fully release its grasp on her. Swinging onto the dirt access road, Brad was flooded with dread. The woods loomed like a great hungry beast eager to swallow Amy whole. As he ran recklessly into the trees, the distant screams began to echo around him. "Amy!" Brad cried desperately, blinking back terrified tears. "Don't give in to it!" The midnight shrieks only grew louder in response. He pushed on frantically, praying she could fight the darkness just one more time. Chapter 14. The screams rose to a fever pitch as Brad plunged recklessly into the pitch-black woods. With each step, the vegetation grew more choked and tangled, as if the forest itself was trying to bar his path. Thorns tore at his clothes and skin, but he barely felt the pain in his frenzied state. Somewhere in this oppressive darkness, Amy was alone and unprotected against forces beyond comprehension. The thought sent panicked adrenaline coursing through Brad's veins. He had to find her before the insatiable evil permeating these woods did. As he crashed through a wall of brambles, Brad stumbled into a small clearing bathed in moonlight streaming between the gnarled branches overhead. At its center stood a lone figure with her back to him. "Amy!" Brad cried out in relief and fear as he staggered into the glade. She turned slowly, eyes widening as she saw him. "What are you doing here?" she asked in a voice that echoed hollowly in the surrounding woods. "You shouldn't have come." "I had to find you," Brad insisted, moving towards her. But she backed away, a profound sadness welling up in her eyes. "It's too late for me now," she nearly whispered. "But you still have a chance. Go. Please." As she uttered this, ghoulish shadows began to close in around the edges of the clearing, accompanied by a chorus of unearthly screams. Amy gazed back at Brad despondently as she began to drift backwards into the wood's dark embrace. "No, I won't leave you," Brad cried desperately, trying to follow. But some invisible force held him back as Amy was swallowed up completely by the shadows. The screams rose to a deafening crescendo, then ceased abruptly. As the last echoes faded, the constraint on Brad suddenly lifted. He ran forward, but found only empty, silent woods filling the clearing where Amy had stood. She was gone. Numbly, Brad staggered back out of the forest until he collapsed to his knees on the roadside by his truck, anguished sobs racking his body. Amy had been right. The darkness here was unrelenting, and now it had claimed her spirit completely. As dawn's first light crept over the trees, Brad gazed back with red-rimmed eyes at the forest that had stolen so much. However long it took, he vowed to discover the secret of what lay hidden within its depths. He owed Amy that. With a shattered heart, he drove away in search of answers and a sliver of hope.